All right, we can
Okay.
continue now.
Good. Next person.
Hare Krishna. सोऽप्यांशगुणः कालात्मा भगवद्दृष्टि गोचरः आत्मानं वैयाकरोद आत्मा विश्वस्य शिश्रीचया. हरे कृष्ण.
सोऽप्यं सगुणकालात्मा भगवद्दृष्टिगोचर आत्मानं व्याकरोत् आत्मा विश्वस्यास्य शिक्षया.
Anyone
Krishna.
else? Okay.
Sopi amsha guna kalatma bhagavad drishti kocharaha atmana vyakarad atma vishvashyasya sishrish shaya. Hare Krishna.
Okay. Anybody else?
Sophiyam Saguna Kalatma Bhagavad Drishti Gochara Atmanam Vyakrodatma Vishvashya Shishrikshaya.
सोऽप्यं सगुणाकालात्मा भगवद्दृष्टिगोचरः आत्मानं व्याकरोदात्मा विश्वस्यास्य सुषक्षया.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Word for word translation. Sa Mahatattva. Api also. Amsha Purusha plenary expansion. Guna chiefly the quality of ignorance. Kala the duration of time. Atma full consciousness. Bhagavat the personality of Godhead. Drishtigocharaha range of sight. Atmanam many different forms. Vyakarot differentiated. Atma reservoir. Vishwasya the would-be entities. Asya of this. Sisrikshaya generates the false ego. Translation. Thereafter, the Mahat Tattva differentiated itself into many different forms as the reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahat Tattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance, and it generates the false ego. It is a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead, with full consciousness of creative principles and time for fructification. Purport by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. And before I read it, I'll just say that this first sentence of the purport really kind of blew my mind, and we'll get into it later. Purport. The Mahat Tattva is the medium between pure spirit and material existence. It is the junction of matter and spirit wherefrom the false ego of the living entity is generated. All living entities are differentiated parts and parcels of the personality of Godhead. Under the pressure of false ego, the conditioned souls, although parts and parcels of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, claim to be the enjoyers of material nature. This false ego is the binding force of material existence. The Lord again and again gives a chance to the bewildered conditioned souls to get free from this false ego. And that is why the material creation takes place at intervals. He gives the conditioned souls all facilities for rectifying the activities of the false ego, but he does not interfere with their small independence as parts and parcels of the Lord. Verse again. Sopyam shagunakalatma bhagavadrishtigochara atmanam vyakarod atma vishwasyasya sishikshaya. Thereafter, the Mahatattva differentiated itself into many different forms as the reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance, and it generates the false ego. It is a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead with full consciousness of creative principles and time for fructification. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Shanyavari Paschita Deshatarine. Another very interesting verse in a short string of verses about the process of creation and specifically this aspect of Mahatattva. Vidura explained, Maitreya explaining some very interesting things to Vidura here. First of all, I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, in all the details of creation. It's a complex thing, and nor will I pretend to understand all of it or most of it or even any of it. But there's a lot of details to it and a lot of things, but there are certain things that we can understand about it and should try to understand about it without getting too bogged down necessarily in the details. Also, I'll just say, in sort of in summary or as an introduction, for those who heard Charu Chandra's class on Tuesday, he explained so well this principle that we don't only study Krishna's Leela in Vrindavan or Krishna's sweet pastimes. Prabhupada once said that Krishna's kissing and Krishna's killing are both the same. So not only Krishna's pastimes in Vrindavan, but also his pastimes in Bhagavad Gita and Mahabharata, and also his pastimes of creation. So we don't falsely or artificially distinguish between them or reject any of them, because they all have something to teach us about Krishna and how to love Krishna. So I just wanted to bring up that point again and keep it in mind as we're discussing today. So to begin the discussion, there's two important, when talking about the material nature and the process of creation, there's two important characteristics that need to be understood. And this is sukshma and stula, or subtle and gross. Some things are more subtle, some things are more gross. And one way of understanding is, what does something gross mean? It's something that's easily grasped, easily perceived, easily manipulated as something that's gross. Even when we say the expression, when you grasp something, it means to grasp it, to hold it in your hand, and to grasp it also means to understand it. So more gross things are more easily graspable, just like of the Bhumirapanalo Vayu, of the 8 material elements of the creation. Earth is very easily graspable, manipulable. We can pick up a rock and hold it in our hands, and it's just going to sit there, and we can hold it and move it here, put it there. So that's the grossest of the material elements is earth. So it's easy to grasp. Next is earth, water. Water is a little harder to grasp, especially if you try to hold it in one hand. The water, it's going to pour out over the edge of your palm and drip and leak between your fingers. And if you really struggle and put your hands together and keep your fingers very tight, for a little while, you could hold a little water in your palms and move it around. But it's more difficult because water is more subtle. Earth, water, fire. Fire is even more difficult to control. We can't control it at all by direct touch because we'll burn ourselves. But if we move the fuel around, we could indirectly manipulate fire a little bit. But that's also difficult to manipulate, and often fire will get out of control and burn your house down. So more difficult to control. Next is earth, water, fire, air. Air is even more difficult to control. You can't even really hold it in your hands. You need some sort of properly made vessel to contain it. And just like Arjuna said, more difficult to control than the blowing wind, because this is a more subtle element. And what to speak of earth, water, fire, air, and ether, which is space or volume or vacuum, however you want to classify it. This is even more difficult to manipulate and more difficult to control and more difficult to comprehend as well. And then beyond these grosser elements, also within the material category, but becoming more subtle, is mind, intelligence, and false ego. And controlling the mind, containing the mind, how difficult is that? That practically no one can do it. Psychologists study it. Intellectuals develop their intellect in so many ways, but actually controlling mind and intelligence is so difficult that even the big yogis struggle with this, controlling the mind. Patanjali made his whole big system of yoga simply to try to accomplish that, to control the mind. And what to speak of the false ego? Practically by definition, in this material world, no one can control their false ego. Rather, they think that's themselves. So all of these things growing more to grasp and to control and to understand with our material facilities. And then what's more subtle even than false ego? This is what we're hearing today. In one sense, more subtle than false ego, you can jump immediately to spirit. Spirit is even more subtle. Now, spirit it's not exactly on the same spectrum as the material elements, which go earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, false ego, increasingly more subtle. And then there's kind of a break, because spirit is of a completely different nature. And yet it's also often described as more subtle than the material elements. And even the Supreme Personality of Godhead is described as more subtle than matter, or the most subtle of all. So there's this division between matter and spirit, and at the same time, this spectrum of gross to subtle. But even within that, there's subdivisions. The entire material elements, earth, water, fire, air, mind, intelligence, false ego, all of these have further subdivisions. More subtle even than false ego, we're hearing today, is the Mahatattva. This Mahatattva is the most subtle aspect of material energy. Before there's even any distinction of material elements, or before there's even any distinction of the modes of material nature. I'm not going to show it or share it here, but for those who are interested, I put in the chat a link to a nice diagram created by, sort of a flow chart created by His Grace Ravindra Swarup Prabhu, showing the process of creation, all the subtle distinctions and what comes from what. And if anyone wants, you can, at your leisure, you could look at that and study that diagram. But this Mahatattva is the most subtle aspect of
I
material
need Prabhu.
creation.
I need the diagram. I want to see.
Okay,
You can send.
I put a link in the chat for anyone who's interested in that. So we have this gross matter and then subtle and more subtle. And within the material realm, the most subtle is this Mahatattva, or sometimes Mahatattva, also the word pradhan is used. They're subtle distinctions, but they're practically interchangeable. So this Mahatattva is so subtle and so you won't, if you could, first of all, you can't look at it, because within the Mahatattva, even the sense objects and the sense organs have not even been created yet. So it's by definition, it's imperceivable. But it's the most subtle form of material energy. Therefore, it's the closest, in one sense, to spiritual existence. And that's what Prabhupada means in the purport today, saying that this is the medium between matter and spirit, the border between matter and spirit, the line between matter and spirit. So if you're trying to find, we all know, I quote this verse almost every class, the Vishnu Shakti Pra Prokta, Kshetra Gyakya Tatak Para, Avidya Karma Sanganya Tritiya Shaktir Ishyate, that Krishna's three energies are there, his internal spiritual energy, the jivas who are also spiritual by nature, but prone to fall down, and the material energy. So the material energy is also coming from Krishna. So if you trace it back, at some point, the material energy is within Krishna or coming from Krishna. So right at that border between Krishna's spiritual energy and the material energy, the dividing line, that razor line between matter and spirit, is the Mahatattva. If you wanted to trace out where everything comes from, coming from Krishna, it's there. And in fact, it's so close that that line between matter and spirit can actually become clouded in one sense. And we see that in this verse, in today's verse. Let's see if I could. Just like the Mahatattva in today's verse is called in the Sanskrit, it's called Angsha. And what does Angsa mean? Angsa means a plenary expansion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or of the Purusha avatars. Angsa, this Angsa has a specific meaning, a plenary expansions. Just like earlier in the Bhagavatam, Ete Chamsa Kalapumsam, right? Krishna's two Bhagavans, and Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but all the different incarnations are Angsa, plenary expansions. And what does plenary mean? Plenary means full. Just like the avatars have all the potency of Krishna. So this Mahatattva, although it's material, it's an Amsa expansion. It contains Krishna's potency in full degree. In other words, it's almost like spirit. It's almost like Krishna himself. Such that it's called Angsa, the Mahatattva. And it's also said in today's verse, Atma Bhagavat Drishti Gochara, that it's the full consciousness of the all-seeing personality of Godhead. This is matter, but this Mahatattva is so close to Krishna that it's just like spirit. Or as I was saying, the line between matter and spirit is becoming blurred. And that makes sense in another way, because in one sense, this differentiation between matter and spirit is it's a distinction that we conditioned material soul, or we conditioned souls make, that, oh, there's matter and there's spirit. But Prabhupada gave the example that the expert electrician takes the electric energy, and when he manipulates that electricity in one way through one type of machine, that electricity will make heat. And when he takes the very same electricity and manipulates it through another machine, it creates refrigeration. So you may see, oh, these are opposites. One is heating, one is refrigeration. But the electrician understands that the same electricity, the same energy, is the source of both. So similarly, matter and spirit are distinctions we make, but at least from one, and they are distinct. They actually are distinct categories, and we analyze them as such. But in another sense, or from another angle of vision, it's all Krishna's energy, and Krishna can use any of his energies in any ways that he wants. So this is a little bit what the Mahatattva is. As Prabhupada said in the purport, the Mahatattva is the medium between pure spirit and material existence. It is the junction of matter and spirit. We know the story or the history of creation of the Purusha avatars, that Karana Dakashayi is there. Karana Dakashayi means Karana Udaka Shayi. He's this big giant Vishnu lying on the Karana Udaka, on the causal ocean, and he's shy, he's resting, he's sleeping, he's laying down. And from his body, all of the universes are coming from his breathing and from the pores of his body, just like Prabhupada considered this important. This is the cover of the first canto of the Bhagavatam, that Mahavishnu's laying in the ocean and the universes are coming out. And it's described, Prabhupada described several times, that these universes are coming out in seed form. And that seed form is the unmanifested material nature, is the Mahatattva. That is the seed that is coming out. And the growth of the seed, when the seed develops, just like if you have a mustard seed, it doesn't look like mustard. It's just a little black ball, a little purplish black ball. But then when the seed grows and fructifies, it sends up a sprout, leaves, flowers, and then the whole thing manifests. So the universe comes out in seed form as this Mahatattva. And Prabhupada explains how it's agitated by time and by the modes of nature, and specifically by the injection of the living entities into it through his glance, which injects all of their desires and false ego. And then from that, as you can see in that diagram I shared, from that, then the modes of nature manifest from the Mahatattva. And from the different modes of nature, then the different aspects of creation come. From the mode of goodness comes the mind, the element of mind, and also the controlling devatas, the deities of the universe. And from passion comes intelligence, and I can't remember now, what is it? I think the sense objects come from that. And then from ignorance comes the Mahatbhuta, the gross material elements, the earth, water, fire, air, ether. So this is how the seed grows. And that seed growing process, let's see, is also described. This is actually also fascinating in the Brahma Samhita. Let's see. This is a very old copy. My book is falling apart, but this is text 13 of Brahma Samhita. Tadroma bila jaleshu bijam sankarshanasya cha Haimanyandani jatani mahabhutavritani too. The spiritual seeds of Sankarshan existing in the pores of skin of Mahavishnu are born as so many golden sperms. These sperms are covered with 5 great elements. So these seeds, they're seeds of Sankarshan. That means they're coming from the Lord. And they're born, and as they're born, they become covered by the 5 great elements. Just as I described, it starts off as Mahatattva, unmanifest, and then all the other elements grow into it and surround it. And from that seed, it grows into the big, gigantic Brahmandas that we're living in now. And this purport is also fascinating. It's short. Bhaktisiddhanta's purport. The language is a little dense, a little intellectual, as Bhaktisiddhanta writes, but I think we could get the sense of what he's saying here. Purport. The prime divine avatar lying in the spiritual causal ocean is such a great affair that in the pores of his divine form spring up myriads of seeds of the universes. Those series of universes are the perverted reflection of the infinite transcendental region. And this is an important line, as long as they remain embedded in his divine form, they embody the principle of spiritual reflection, having the form of golden eggs. Nevertheless, by the creative desire of Mahavishnu, the minute particles of the great elements, which are constituents of the mundane, efficient, and material causal principles, envelop them. When those golden sperms coming out with the exhalation of Mahavishnu enter into the unlimited accommodating chamber of the limited potency, they become enlarged by the non-conglomerate great elements. So what is he saying here? That the universes are coming out in this undifferentiated seed form. They're reflections of the spiritual energy, and we've heard that in Bhagavad Gita, just like the banyan tree on the bank of the river. When we see its reflection, it seems reversed, with the roots up and the branches down. So this material energy is a perverted reflection. But then he goes further. He says, as long as they remain embedded in his divine form, they embody the principle of spiritual reflection. So if we were to try to determine where is the exact point where spiritual energy becomes material energy, this is it. When those seed universes leave Mahavishnu's body, then they become matter. Then they lose that spiritual quality and become matter. So this is the transition point. And when they, coming out of the exhalation of Mahavishnu, enter into the limited potency of Maya, they become enlarged by the non-conglomerate great elements. The non-conglomerate great elements means the Mahabhuta, the gross ingredients of material energy. Bhumirapana vayu kamino buddhir evacha ahankara. These are the Mahabhutas. So this is the transition. And as long as they're within the body of Mahavishnu, they're spiritual. And when they leave, they become material. So in this way, the Mahatattva is so closely associated with spirit and with the body of the Lord that therefore in this verse, Prabhupada seems to be equating it with spiritual energy, or at least on the border with spiritual energy. So this Mahatattva is the very first step in the creation. And from that, everything is coming, everything is expanding. And when everything finally comes, as in that diagram, there's the Mahatattva. It gets agitated by time and by the entrance of the jivas, and the modes of nature come, and mind, intelligence, false ego, and the demigods, and all of the gross elements. Then we have the whole universe. And what this is Sarga and Visarga. If we can remember back to the 10 topics of Srimad Bhagavatam, the first two is Sarga and Visarga. And Sarga is the Mahatattva coming out of the body of Mahavishnu in this seed form. The universe is in seed form. This is Sarga. And not only that, that seed then expands, and all of the elements and all of the ingredients of creation come from it. And then the demigods also come from it. And therefore, when Lord Brahma appears and he takes those ingredients manifested from the seed universes, all growing out of the Mahatattva, then he fashions them into the actual practical world that we see around us. This is Visarga. So the first two items of the 10 topics of Bhagavatam are Sarga and Visarga, the creation of the elements and the putting together, the engineering of those elements into the world around us, including our bodies. That's also part of that creation. This is Sarga and Visarga. Let's see what time it is. I'm sorry. Another way of looking at creation is through which we've been hearing a lot of earlier in this, in the previous canto, is the description of the Virat Rupa, the universal form. This is also process of creation. And there in second canto, chapter 1, text 35, the Bhagavatam says, Vijnana Shaktim Mahim Amananti. The principle of Mahatattva is the consciousness of the omnipresent Lord. So this is in the Virat Rupa also. We know the Virat Rupa, just like it's described things, his hair is the heavenly planets, or the veins of his body are the rivers and the oceans, his bones are his the stacks of his bones are the rocks and mountains of this world. So here's the Mahatattva is described as the consciousness of the omnipresent Lord. Just like today's verse says, Drishti Gochara. This is the all-seeing consciousness of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is the Mahatattva. So this is in understanding what the Mahatattva is, how it's the transition between the actual spiritual consciousness and awareness of the Lord. And because the Mahatattva, which is the substrate of all material energy, is the consciousness of the Lord, therefore Krishna understands and knows everything within this universe. First canto, first verse is Janmadyasya Yatonvayadi Iteratas Charteshu. That Krishna is the source of creation, maintenance, and dissolution. Janmadyasya Anvayad Iteratas Chartesha, that he directly and indirectly knows everything within the material universe. He knows it directly because he's everywhere. And he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Of course, he knows everything everywhere. There's no such thing as a corner of the creation that is hidden from his view or hidden from his understanding. So he directly knows it, and also indirectly, because the Mahatattva is the substrate of the whole creation there, and the Mahatattva is the manifestation of the Lord's all-knowing consciousness, although it's matter in one sense. And through that, he also knows everything and is aware of everything. One other interesting thing about this Mahatattva is the reverse of creation. If we take the creation and we reverse it, and just like, how would I explain? If you have a pile of engine parts just lying in a loose pile, and you try to put that together, that is very difficult to do. But if you have an engine and you take it apart, and people who have worked on cars or worked on electronics or on different machinery know this, that if you're taking a machine apart, you take out one screw and you have to set it aside, and you have to remember or write down, this screw goes into this place. And then you take out the spring. This spring goes in this place. And then when you know where everything goes, then you could put the machine together. You could take the machine apart. So we've heard about putting the machine together, putting the universe together. There's also the process of taking it apart. And this is described, let's see, in different ways. Here in the second canto, chapter 2, text 30. Translation: the devotee, thus surpassing the gross and the subtle forms of coverings, enters the plane of egoism. And in that status, he merges the material modes of nature, ignorance and passion, in this point of neutralization, and thus reaches egoism in goodness. After this, all egoism is merged in the Mahatattva, and he comes to the point of pure self-realization. This process of self-realization being described is exactly the opposite of the creation that we've been hearing about. Surpassing the gross and subtle forms enters egoism. So we heard how false ego is the root of the creation of the modes of material nature and all the gross and subtle material elements. So he's reversing this process, going from the different material elements to the plane of egoism, of ahankara. Then he reaches egoism in pure goodness. Then all of that is merged into the Mahatattva. Just as the living entities being injected into the Mahatattva causes the appearance of false ego, so the sage who is seeking liberation takes that false ego and reverses it. He merges it back into the Mahatattva in this reverse process. So this is the process of liberation described here. And one other example of that, very explicit example of that, is in the first canto, chapter 13, text 55, talking about Dhritarashtra, about Dhritarashtra's liberation. Dhritarashtra, who was so offensive and so corrupted, he was actually incapable of taking directly to the path of bhakti. So he took to this other path of meditative yoga. And what was his process? This is Narada Muni after Dhritarashtra left home, and all the Pandavas, or at least Yudhishthira, was very much lamenting, oh, where'd he go? And Sanjaya was lamenting, oh, my master has gone, he's cheated me. And Narada came and explained to him what had happened, that he had left home to pursue self-realization. And Narada Muni said, Dhritarashtra will have to amalgamate his pure identity with intelligence and then merge into the Supreme Being with knowledge of his qualitative oneness as a living entity with the Supreme Brahman. Being freed from the blocked sky, he will have to rise to the spiritual sky. And in the purport, Prabhupada explains this process. The living being, by his desiring to lord it over the material world and declining to cooperate with the Supreme Lord, contacts the sum total of the material world, namely the Mahatattva. And from the Mahatattva, his false identity with the material world, intelligence, mind, and senses is developed. Skipping ahead a little. By the yogic process, when his pure identity is realized in self-realization, one has to revert to the original position by amalgamating the 5 gross elements and the subtle elements into the Mahatattva again. Thus, getting freed from the clutches of the Mahatattva, he has to merge into the existence of the Supersoul. So this yogic process is actually a process of reversing this process of creation, going back to the Mahatattva, and then as the Mahatattva, as described by Bhaktisiddhanta, loses its spiritual nature when it leaves the body of Mahavishnu, therefore these sages want to enter back into the body of Vishnu to regain their spiritual nature. So this is how liberation is a reversal, a turning around and undoing of this process of creation. As creation goes from the most subtle to grosser, until we have this whole gross world around us, liberation is taking all those gross things and merging them into their subtle antecedents until we reach the Mahatattva, which is the closest aspect to the existence of the Lord. So this is the process of pralaya, or the process of destruction. And this has different phases. There's nitya pralaya. Nitya pralaya means the pralaya, or the destruction that is going on all the time. When you're driving down the road and your car breaks down, that's a pralaya. When you wake up in the morning and you have one more gray hair than you had the day before, that's pralaya. Or you wake up one morning and you don't wake up, you're dead. That's pralaya. So this nitya pralaya, it's happening constantly. Another pralaya is, we heard about how Lord Brahma engineers with the material elements this Brahmanda, this creation all around us. So at the end of a day of Lord Brahma, when that is all dissolved, that's another kind of pralaya, and that's called what's that called? Naimitika pralaya, meaning occasional. So at every day, at the end of a day of Brahma, however many billions or trillions of years that is, I can't remember. That pralaya is going on. So that itself is a reversal of the process of visarga. Then there's the prakritika pralaya, and that's the pralaya at the end of a lifetime of Lord Brahma, when all of the material elements melt away into their more subtle substances they came from, and merges back into the Mahatattva, and all of this, now these universes have reverted back to their seed form, and they're all withdrawn again back into the body of Mahavishnu. This is Prakritika Pralaya. And there's one other Pralaya, which is called Atyantika Pralaya, which is the final Pralaya, the final destruction. And that destruction is liberation. And all of these processes are the same. It's the breakdown of the material elements into their constituent parts. But only in liberation is it permanent, because then when you return to the spiritual world, the association with matter is completely finished. The whole business is finished. So this is in one sense, a description of the process of liberation. But as devotees, we do not do this yogic process like Dhritarashtra did. Dhritarashtra had to because he was so offensive, he couldn't take to bhakti. And yogis have their own egos, and what to speak of impersonalists have their egos and their foolish reasons for not worshiping the Supreme Lord. But devotees accomplish this just by worshiping Krishna. Arjuna says, O Madhusudana, the system of yoga which you have summarized appears impractical and unendurable to me. So devotees don't have to take the process that is impractical or the process that is unendurable. We actually accomplish the exact same thing, but through worshiping Krishna. So not only is it an easier process and a better process, and in Kali Yuga, the only process available to us, devotional service to attain this final liberation, to wind up this material energy and return to our original position. Not only is it only possible through devotional service, but devotional service gives a liberation that even the yogis who are successful at this cannot attain. Because generally, just like we heard about Dhritarashtra, he attained a somewhat impersonal liberation of merging into somehow into the existence of the Lord. What to speak of some of the demons that Krishna killed, who also merged into his body. So devotees have no taste for that, no desire for that. And that higher liberation of becoming Krishna's servant, this is actually the best and only real liberation. This is only attainable through bhakti. But still, the process is the same in one sense, the winding up of the material elements into subtler forms until we're left with our pure spiritual identity. Jiver Sarupai Krishna Nityadas. This is the real reversal or reversion that we want. We're all eternally Krishna's servants. And when we forget that, this is the same idea as when the seed universes leave the body of Mahavishnu. We heard how from Bhaktisiddhanta, how upon leaving the body of Vishnu, they leave aside that spiritual nature and become matter. So when we leave aside Krishna's service, then we become covered, just like the universe grows out of that seed and becomes covered by earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, ego, the three modes of material nature and desire and lust and all of these things grow out of the seed universe. That's also how it grows out of that seed desire of, I don't want to serve Krishna. And then this whole big mess of material conditioned life going on since time immemorial grows out of that. So that to revert to that original position, not the original position of just recognizing yourself as a spirit, as aham brahmasmi, that's incomplete, but to understand yourself as the servant of Krishna. That's only possible through bhakti. So therefore, this is our process. That's the process, the only process in Kali Yuga. Chanting the holy names, worshiping Krishna. Manmana bhavamad bhakto mad yajimam namaskaru. All of these things, this is what is going to undo the material creation. This is going to undo the sufferings and the complexities of the material world. Individually, and therefore we preach it also to do it on a wider and wider scale. And that was Prabhupada's hope, that the whole thing, the whole world could be turned around like that by spreading Krishna consciousness and undo this material creation and revert us to that original form of devotees of Krishna. So, like I said, we could get a little bogged down in these aspects of creation. But on the other hand, Prabhupada would often explain it. Maitreya is explaining it here, and it comes up many, many times in the Bhagavatam. So we don't have to learn every detail of the creation. I'm not saying that. But when we understand the process, then we could understand how it applies to us and do it not through the yogic process, but through devotional service, enacting that same thing. And even if Prabhupada would also, even if we just have a simple understanding that, what's that? Like the Bible says, in the beginning, God created. In one sense, that's enough also. If you have complete faith in that and complete understanding in that, that's actually enough to get you to surrender to Krishna and to reverse this whole material contamination. But if we have a brain and if we have intelligence, then we could understand more. And Prabhupada said, just like the Bible says, God created everything, but the details of that creation are not explained very well or even at all. And therefore, many people won't take it seriously. But the Bhagavatam explains it in some detail, in quite some detail, with logic and explanation and detail and step-by-step process. So that will also appeal to our minds and our intellect. And also, like I said, hopefully give us some understanding of how this material world works. When we understand that, then we could understand when our mind tries to compel us to pursue sense gratification, we can understand what's happening and where this desire comes from and how it manifested through the whole cycle and process of creation. And that could help us. That could very well help us in controlling our mind and staying fixed in the process of devotional service. Or even if we just understand it simply, that everything's coming from Krishna, therefore let me serve and worship Krishna, that's also equally valid. But again, since it's being described here, we'll spend a day or two talking about it. Let's see. Yeah, one final thing, just like going back to the point of like Dhritarashtra or persons who take this yogic process, they can at best revert back to the point of Mahatattva and then enter into the body of Krishna or into the body of Vishnu, the Karana Dakashai Vishnu. But the devotee goes so far beyond that, just as Karana Ete Chamsa Kalapum Sam, Krishna's two Bhagavan Swayam, those amsas and kalas are there, but Krishna's two Bhagavan Swayam. So the devotee doesn't merge into Mahavishnu or or even worse, merge into the Brahma Jyoti or the Purusha avatars, because as the Karana Dakashai Vishnu, he's one of the Purusha avatars. And then those Purusha avatars come from the Chaturvyuha and back. That's also another complicated process that I can't remember all of it. Through the Chaturvyuha, and then back through Balaram, who is the source of all the expansions, and then back to Krishna himself, who is the source of all expansions. So that's what the devotee obtains, and not merging into his body or merging into his existence. The devotee will never accept that. But merging into a loving relationship with Krishna. That's what is obtainable by the devotee, so far beyond the yogic process or meditative process or any of these other processes. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for your kind attention. I hope that class wasn't too boring or weird or anything, and I hope, maybe some people could get something practical out of it. I hope so. I just found it very fascinating how Prabhupada explained the Mahatattva as that right at that border where the transition line, that tatashta,
Matter and spirit.
spirit and matter. I found that very fascinating. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Any questions, comments, or discussion?
Thank you very much, Prabhu.
Thank
The
you,
way you
Mata.
explained that Bhumirapo Analavu Ayu Kamana Budriyaucha. So that explanation I just first now today I heard, which is very good for me. It's very informative. So and then about Mahatattva and what is it between matter and spirit also. That Amsa, that is also very nice information.
Yeah, I found that very interesting, and also seeing how it was confirmed by Bhaktisiddhanta's commentary on Brahma Samhita. I found that interesting. Thank you. Anything else? Question or comment?
And I need that
Oh.
diagram what you made it. You said you'll send it.
Can you open, if you open the chat box,
I'll look.
you see chat at the bottom of your page?
Okay.
Open that up. Do you see my comment? If you see my comment there and just click on it, it should open on your computer.
Okay. I will do it, Prabhu.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? Jai, thank you very much, everybody, for your
Thank you,
kind
Prabhu.
attention. I hope everyone's doing well in Philly. Everyone take care and have a wonderful day. Please accept my
Cold Philly. Chapatanam Pavadebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Everybody have
Thank you,
a
Prabhu.